Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this workshop. Um, we will wait another couple of minutes before starting. I see that we have already 73 participants now logged on. I think that we have a total of over 100. So we'll just leave it another couple of minutes before starting to allow people to log on. Thank you. So good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's workshop on digital connectivity and economic diversification. This workshop is being held in the context of the 2020-2022 Aid for Trade Work Programme entitled Empowering Connected Sustainable Trade. And members will recall that a workshop on digital connectivity and economic diversification is one of the activities foreseen in that work plan. The topic of today's webinar is pertinent in the context of the Aid for Trade monitoring and evaluation exercise. And today's workshop will help us understand the issues of digital connectivity and economic diversification and how these are being addressed, both in that exercise and also in the review that the global review that will be held this year. And a critical component of this question is how digital connectivity fits with the economic diversification objectives of developing and least developing countries. Now, as you will have noticed, I'm not Ambassador Paracha, the chair of the Committee on Trade and Development. Unfortunately, he is unable to attend today's webinar and has asked me to stand in and chair today's event for him. Another change to announce is that I'm delighted to inform you that Pramila Crivelli, an economist in the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department of the Asian Development Bank, has agreed to fill the vacant slot in the workshop agenda in the second section dealing with practice perspectives. So we're delighted to have her on board. The workshop will proceed as follows. So first of all, the Aid for Trade unit will get us underway, my colleague Teo and Bees, by setting the scene, giving you some preliminary insights into the questions that deal with digital connectivity in this year's monitoring and evaluation exercise. The presentations that follow Teo's initial overview will be organized into two separate sections. The first session will look at the issue of policy perspectives, and then the second one will deal with practice perspectives. And after the interventions of the speakers in each session, I will then open the floor for questions and comments. I'd also encourage you to ask your questions or make comments by inserting them in the comment box. This you can do while the speakers are talking if you wish, and then we can pick up the questions either immediately when they finish or in the Q&A session. So using that comment box works well and allows me to direct different questions. You can obviously address questions not just in English, but also French and Spanish. And do please, if you wish, use the raise hand function to request the floor. We will provide an oral summary of today's workshop at tomorrow's formal CTD A for Trade meeting. As such, I would request any member who wishes to make a formal statement to do so at tomorrow's meeting. This will allow us to have a more free-ranging discussion today. An audio recording of the workshop and copies of all presentation will be made available on the WTO website. There is an event webpage that you can find, so do please look at that after the event. I would also encourage participants to consult the room documents, and they can be consulted at the same place. By room documents, I mean copies of the presentations. So without further ado, let me now move over to my colleague Teo Mbis, who will give us some preliminary insights from the this year's monitoring and evaluation exercise. And I think the computer is not as needs a little espresso before we get going. So I think we will be there just a moment while the presentation loads. So here you are. Over to you, Teo. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael, for giving me the floor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to all, and thank you for joining us. I propose we start today with an overview of responses received as part of the monitoring and evaluation exercise. You can see from the bottom number highlighted in yellow, the overall total of questionnaire received, which now stands at 72. And now this compares, we haven't quite reached the number that we had reached in 2019, 135. However, the links are still open. We can see that respondents are still active, and I do not want to presuppose of what the chair will decide to do, but if you are filling in your questionnaires, please continue as we are still receiving them. When it comes to the distribution of questionnaires, we have a well-balanced geographical distribution of questionnaires, and also in relation to the income levels. You can see that when it comes to developing countries, we have 39 questionnaires received so far, with half of that being received from least developed countries. We have 2 questionnaires received from regional economic communities and 29 questionnaires received from donors. We've also received 2 questionnaires from South-South partners, China and Indonesia. Because this workshop focuses on digital connectivity, I propose that we look at the 6 questions that were specifically focused on the topic of digital connectivity. Here's a first one, which was responded by about virtually all the respondents. And you can see a very strong correlation here, which you'll also find, I think, in the upcoming responses. Yes, COVID-19 has acted as an accelerator for the move to the digital economy in your country. Next slide, please. Do you have a national strategy, policy, or plan for digital connectivity, including digital economy, e-commerce, circular e-commerce? And we can see here that the vast majority of partners and donors, 50% for donors and 70% for partners, have responded that they do have a national strategy for digital connectivity or digital economy. Next slide, please. A third question asked respondents to identify those sectors where they view that digital connectivity could best support the transition to sustainable development. And what's interesting here as well is you can see that the responses from partners and donors fit very well. It's very interesting with services coming at the top of responses above all the other sectors. Which areas has the COVID-19 pandemic exposed shortcomings in national digital connectivity? The responses are quite spread out, and what I propose to do is for you to focus on the top 5 responses that were featured by developing countries. And we can see here that insufficient or uneven internet coverage comes as a first, equal to poor digital skills and IT literacy, followed by inadequate network infrastructure, digital payment issues, and poor access to internet services. Now, if we look at the next slide, the donor slide, we can see that for this particular question, the responses don't quite correlate as much as the previous one. The donors identified inadequate network infrastructure as a top shortcoming in relation to digital connectivity, followed by insufficient internet coverage, poor access to internet services, and poor digital skills. We've seen these responses in the partner questionnaire, but in a different order. Next slide, please. Is digital connectivity reflected as a priority in your national sustainable development plans? A very strong yes from both baskets, partners and donors. Next slide, please. And additionally to the quantitative information that was requested, we invited respondents to provide qualitative information. This is a very short selection, which we wanted to highlight. We've received responses from many partner countries. Togo identified a capacity building program for e-commerce that was being developed currently. Cambodia highlighted its e-commerce strategy to support cross-border trade and its MSMEs. We have an interesting regional e-commerce strategy, which is developed at the level of the Pacific states, which was highlighted by Fiji. And Pakistan presented an interesting project to support its youth to access digital services in the region of Peshawar. Donors also provided very interesting examples. We have a USAID program in the Philippines to increase digital connectivity. Now, if I can remind you that once published, once received, the questionnaires will be published on our website, wto.org/aid4trade, and on the OECD website, which we'll provide you with the details. We have other examples from ITC, UNCTAD, Germany. You can read them faster than I can say them, and the European Union. So here concludes my overview to you on the responses on digital connectivities. Responses are still coming, and I invite you, if you encounter any issue or for more information, to reach us at our email address, which you can see, or at our webpage. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks very much, Teo. Cracking timekeeping, bang on 10:15 as scheduled. So thank you for that. Something that I think we can already announce is that ahead of tomorrow's meeting is that the chair has agreed to extend the deadline for the submissions of the monitoring questionnaires one last time. And so the that very final deadline will be Friday, the 18th of February. So as you mentioned, Teo, this is a preliminary view on the basis of the responses that we've had so far. And hopefully with those a little bit more than 2 additional weeks, we'll get to a higher number. Something also just to note is that partner countries we typically refers to developing countries and in particular LDCs. So I think you've set the scene very well for us, Taya. It's clear that COVID has acted as an accelerator for the digital economy for members at all levels of development, and also that there's an increasing number of members with digital connectivity and trade strategies, and who are mainstreaming that into their national development plans as well. And to further develop those insights that you've shared with us, Taya, let's now move to the first session of today's workshop on policy perspectives. And here, what we'll do is we'll look into the policy perspectives of offered to us by the OECD, UNCTAD, and the World Bank. And we have 3 excellent speakers to do that for us today. We have Sylvia Sorescu, who is a policy analyst in the Emerging Policy Issues Division, the Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD. Torbjorn Fredriksson, who is head of the e-commerce and digital economy branch at UNCTAD, and Mark Williams, who is the practice manager at responsible for global knowledge and expertise and digital development global practice at the World Bank Group. And I see, Mark, you're online, so fantastic, great, good to see you this morning. So our first speaker will be Sylvia Sorescu, who will be presenting on opportunities and challenges for trade in the digital area. So over to you, Sylvia. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good day to all participants connecting today to the workshop. And thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate and share some of the insights from our work on digital trade at the OECD. I will just take 1 second to share my screen. Which I hope should be up right now. Yes. So I would like to take the next couple of minutes just to provide a brief overview of some of the recent work that we have been doing, looking at some of the opportunities and some of the challenges for trade in the digital era, together with the digital trade team at the OECD. So starting off in this session, which tries to focus on the policy perspective, I wanted to take a second just to look at what are the different components of digital trade. And what we see overall is that digital trade is different, and that reductions in the cost of sharing information have been leading to changes in what and how we trade, although not why we trade. So what we see with digitalization is more traditional trade, so across all kinds of sectors, from agro-food to different manufacturing sectors. Also more digitally ordered goods, such as parcels, which again are connecting MSMEs and individuals across the world, also with some implications for customs and other agencies at border that have to deal with this growing influx of parcels. We also see more digitally delivered trade, including some new services, and as well more bundled or smart products. And we also observe a digitalization in trade processes, which again enables some of these procedures to be sped up at the border, and again help trade develop across all kinds of different sectors as well as parcels. And overall, we also observe a more cross-border data flows that basically underpin all the digital transactions, but also raise many new issues. So going to the opportunities for trade in the digital era, I would just like to quickly go through 5 observations from some of the recent work that we have been doing, looking at some of the impacts of digital trade. So first, we have seen that, again, digitalization is not just about ICT sectors, but we see that increasing digitalization basically raises trade in goods, services, and also parcels. And the key takeaway from the chart that you can see here is that we have observed that a 10% increase in digitalization leads to about 2% growth in trade in goods, as well as 3% growth in trade in services. And more recently, we have also been able to look at cross-border trade in parcels, where again, a 10% increase in digitalization leads to about an increase of 4% in parcels trade. So there is, again, potential for digitalization to increase trade across all kinds of different sectors. We also see that digitalization allows to reap more benefits from trade agreements. And basically, when we interact digital connectivity with the existence of a regional trade agreement, we see again that increasing digitalization by 10% basically adds around 2.3% more in trade when we also have an existence of an RTA between 2 countries. The third observation, when looking at the work on cross-border trade in parcels, is that we also note that trade facilitation is more and not less important in this digital age. And then using data on trade in parcels and matching that with the indicators that we have for trade facilitation helps us see that improving a wide range of processes at the border, but including automatization of these, can raise trade in parcels by between 6 and 14%. So again, it is really an observation that helps to see how trade facilitation is important in this digital age. A fourth observation from this empirical work is also that digital technologies can really help many countries overcome trade cost barriers and increase export propensity, particularly for smaller firms in developing countries. And again, one of the key takeaways from this chart is to see that this impact is much higher for small and medium-sized enterprises than for larger firms. And a last takeaway from this empirical work really focuses on the importance of access to digital services inputs. That again, when we look at countries at all different levels of development, we see that this helps drive domestic value added in exports. And then the key takeaway from the graph that you see in this slide is that this impact is really much more important for lower middle income countries and lower income countries. But again, we see that having access to these digital services inputs in the production process for increasing productivity is really important for all countries at all different levels of development. So having looked at these observations on opportunities and why it is important for digitalization to be present in all kinds of different sectors, we can try to have a look at what we have been observing in terms of the challenges for trade in this digital era. And here, we of course see that in terms of digital connectivity, which is the key theme of today's workshop, there is still quite a big heterogeneity across the world in terms of the internet use. And I think in the following presentation, we will be delving deeper into the different aspects of digital connectivity. But basically, we do see that this heterogeneity is not present only across different regions, but also, again, in terms of different levels of development, with about a 63% average across the world in terms of the percentage of individuals that are using internet. We can see that the access to internet use is growing, but challenges still remain. And I will come back to this with some reflections at the end, also in terms of how aid for trade could support this going further. A second observation in terms of the challenges is that we also see that there is still a persistent fragmentation in the services regulatory environment for digital trade. And in this chart, you can see one of the tools that we have at the OECD, which is the OECD Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, with its most recent update for 2021, and that now includes 74 economies around the world, is that we still see quite a big heterogeneity in terms of this regulatory environment across regions, but also in terms of some of the trends. So while we see overall that barriers are growing, trends are slightly different across regions, but the key takeaway from the chart on the left is that we do still see this quite important heterogeneity across the different regions that the indicator covers. The indicator also allows to see where these barriers are most persistent. And what we do see by looking at the composition of the Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index is that on average, for the countries that are covered, most barriers lie in digital infrastructure and connectivity. So again, an important fragmentation, but also different measures that compose this services regulatory environment for digital trade. And we see also this, this fragmentation and this dynamic, including in the measures that condition the movement of data. And the key highlight of the chart that you see here is that we do see the number of data regulations going up quite significantly in the most recent years for which we have data. And we see that, that this is very, very dynamic throughout the most recent years. So again, we do not only see these changes and this fragmentation in the regulatory environment for digital services trade, but also for this specific aspects that condition the movement of data. So overall, in terms of the policy environment, what we do see is that digitalization has made trade policy more complex. And just a key snapshot in the slide here, with the example of purchasing an ebook, the key takeaway would be is that these barriers in the end can end up being cumulative. And if we think about a simple transaction, such as the cross-border purchase of an ebook, we observe that this really rests on a series of factors that supports this transaction. So we can think that it depends on the access to a retailer's website, which in turn depends on the regulatory environment in which the retailer establishes his web page. It depends also the cost of internet access to a consumer, which again, in turn, can be affected by the regulatory environment in the telecommunications sector. It depends on an individual's ability to pay electronically, but also on the download capacity or bandwidth of the network, and also on the different tariff or non-tariff barriers that are faced by the physical device used to read the ebook. So again, key takeaway is that we do see all these different enabling or supporting factors coming together in the digital space and overall making trade policy in the digital era much more complex. So to finish off in some of the takeaways and seizing the opportunities from digital trade and also leveraging it for economic recovery, where we do see, of course, that the benefits of digitalization for trade and of trade for digitalization are really not automatic. And they require actions across really different numbers of policy areas, from building the digital skills, addressing the digital divides to improve access to information, as well as access to ITC goods and services, and more affordable and reliable internet connections. And I think, again, we will delve into some of these issues as well in the next presentation. But also that we need this more holistic approach to market openness and understanding as well how trade policy interacts with other policy domains, such as privacy, innovation, competition, taxation, and many others. Coming back to not just to the example of trade in parcels, but to trade in different sectors overall, we see as well that more work is needed to digitalize not only trade processes, but also trade documents. And throughout all of this space, we do believe that international cooperation and technical assistance through very important initiatives that we are discussing today, such as Aid for Trade, can support countries in addressing many of these challenges that relate to digital connectivity, skill gaps, or trade facilitation. And a really important area comes back to the regulatory environment that underpins all this. And we see from another part of our work, which covers the digital trade inventory, is that there is a solid basis of some of these international instruments to address the regulatory challenges that we were seeing in the previous slides. And that ensuring that the benefits are realized and that the opportunities for digital trade are seized really requires a regulatory environment that allows governments to respond to many of these new challenges that revolve around digitalization. We see that there are many discussions that are underway, whether at the joint statement initiative on e-commerce, but also in trade agreements or digital economy agreements. And we have tried to summarize in the digital trade inventory where there are where this mapping of the regulatory environment across international instruments as well as regional trade agreements, to see also where some of the commonalities and complementarities lie. So we hope that this could provide an evidence base for seeing how to make more advances in making the regulatory environment more homogeneous through some of these discussions. So I would like to end here, and thank you again once again for the invitation, and then look forward to the next presentations and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. That was excellent overview of OECD work. And just for clarity's sake, those figures that you mentioned in terms of at the start of the presentation with regard to increases in digitalization, they referred to increases in parcel trade. That's correct.
So thanks to you, Michael, for the question. So the increases in parcels trade refer to the chart where I was highlighting the impacts from more or improved trade facilitation. But the figures in the first chart really touched upon all goods sectors and all different services sectors. So we really tried to provide a wide overview of the different sectors and then the impacts of digitalization. I hope that is clear, but I'm happy to come back to some of those.
It was. I think it was just more us here getting organized in terms of sort of the overall presentation. But thanks very much for clarifying that. And I think you've set up nicely those with that presentation. Then our next speaker, Torbjörn Fredriksson, who will look at these issues in a little bit more in more depth, and also against the context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So, Torbjörn, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining. Torbjörn, I think you might be muted.
Oh gosh. Let's see. Start again. Is that better? Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you very much. And good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I very much appreciate this opportunity to share with you some of the recent trends that we have observed in terms of digital trade in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think the presentation that Theo made in the beginning of our workshop was quite interesting, and one thing that really struck me was the observation that while services was the area that where partner countries saw the greatest opportunities for digitalization, agriculture was not very far behind. And I think this is very important to keep in mind, that it really covers the whole set of industries and sectors as we move forward in digitalization. I thought I wanted to start by talking about how ICT goods trade has evolved during the pandemic. Of course, we have data now up to 2020. And as you can see, despite the overall decline in trade flows during the 2020, we saw that ICT goods trade actually increased somewhat. And this we see as related to the increased reliance on digital solutions during the pandemic, whether it was to do teleworking, teleconferencing, buying online, and so on and so forth. You can see also that the highest growth rate was observed for electronic components, and secondly for computers and peripheral equipment during 2020. Looking at global exports of ICT goods, they reached almost 2.3 trillion in 2020. That was a growth of about 4%. But one important observation here is that ICT goods exports are highly concentrated. East and Southeast Asia, they accounted for about 4/5 of the total in 2020. And the highest growth rates have also been seen in that year among exporters from that region, whereas other significant exporters of ICT goods, such as India, Mexico, and Turkey, saw negative growth in 2020. There was also big variation across regions and development groups. In particular, the least developed countries and African countries saw their exports of ICT goods, which were of course not very big to start with, but they really plummeted by between 50 and 80%. So I think the observation here to take away is that those countries that were particularly well positioned to participate in trade in ICT goods, they reinforced their positions even further, whereas those that were less prepared were not as well positioned to take advantage of the growing demand for ICT goods during the first year of the pandemic. If we turn to services, we see a similar pattern in a sense. If you look at the chart furthest to the left here, you see the long-term trend in the share of ICT-enabled services, in ICT services and in digitally deliverable services. And you see there's been a slow upward moving trend in the total share of, total services exports. But if you go to 2019 and 2020, you see a very sharp increase. So the share of total services exports related to ICT services went from 10 to 14% in 1 year. And for digitally deliverable services, it went from 52 to 64% in only that year of the pandemic. But again, you can also see that there is a big discrepancy in the share of digitally deliverable services as well as in ICT services, depending on which country we're looking at. So the highest shares you can observe for the most advanced economies, and the lowest shares you'll see for the least advanced economies. So again, the ability to take advantage of digitalization varies a lot between countries and regions. Now, I've been talking about digitally deliverable services, and why not talk about digitally delivered services? Well, in fact, very few countries do collect information and statistics on the share of services exports that are actually digitally delivered. And to our knowledge, the only ones that have done so completely are Costa Rica and India, that have used a methodology that was developed by UNCTAD a few years ago to generate more precise numbers in this area. What I wanted to do here is to show you some results from Costa Rica, just to illustrate how much more detail you can get if you have proper statistics in this area. So when we talk about digitally deliverable services, we are relying on statistics from the balance of payments. So if you look at the BOP statistics for Costa Rica up until 2018, you see between 2016 and 2018, the bottom row shows the share of digitally deliverable or potentially ICT-enabled services went from 4.1 billion to $4.5 billion. Now, if you look at the results from their actual survey that were taken for 2016, 2017, and 2018, you'll see that the actual ICT-enabled services, or the services that were digitally delivered, went from 3.3 to 3.7 billion during these years. And if you look at the different types of services that were actually digitally delivered to some extent, there are two types of services that dominate the scene. The first is the business services, management, administration, and back office services, and computer services. These two account for about 80% of the total. But if you look at the column furthest to the right, you see that there's big variation in the extent to which potentially ICT-enabled services are actually digitally delivered. So you see telecommunications at the top. Everything that was exported in that sector was delivered digitally, as one would expect. But otherwise, it ranges from 58% in the case of sales and marketing services, and 67% in the case of education and training services, to an average of 96% in the case of Costa Rica. So the question then arises, what can we do to enhance our ability to take advantage of digital trade? And as is the topic of this particular session, affordable and reliable ICT connectivity for people and enterprises is really a number one. Here, it's not only a question of having access to the internet, but also having access to internet at a price and quality that is required to make full use of the digital solutions that exist. A second important area relates to education, skills, and awareness. There's still too little attention paid to ICT at all levels of education in many countries. And here we see a big importance of collaboration with the private sector when developing new curricula in this field to make sure that the kind of skills that are produced are the ones that are demanded also in the labor market. And there is a need to strengthen the ability of teachers to train students at all levels in this area. And we see a growing need, not just for pure digital skill, but also various kinds of non-cognitive skills that are important in the digital world. Trade facilitation, our OECD speaker mentioned recently, and it's very important, especially as the form of trade that is resulting from e-commerce changes in nature compared to the traditional trade patterns. There's a big importance of supporting the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in terms of use of ICT so that they can participate more effectively in digital trade. It's still the case that large firms all around the world are much more active users of digital solutions than smaller businesses. And that, of course, has implications as global value chains become more and more digitalized for their ability to participate in global trade. We see big divides not only between countries, but also, of course, within countries, and the gender divide is particularly pronounced. And it is also the case that the gender divides are the most pronounced in the least developed countries and in Africa. So here we need to look at ways to strengthen the ability of women to participate in the digital economy, not only as users and buyers, but also as producers and innovators and entrepreneurs. And finally, which was also mentioned, we need to improve the regulatory frameworks in many areas of the digital economy. And we also need to improve the measurement of the digital trade and the digital economy. The thing we always talk about in these meetings is e-commerce. And as we know, very few developing countries are currently properly measuring e-commerce. So we need to improve in that area. And that is, of course, in the context of Aid for Trade, very happy to support member states in a number of areas, from undertaking country assessments on what needs to be done to improve their ability to participate in the digital economy, to the measurement on the empowerment of women digital entrepreneurs. We're doing this very much in partnership with our E-Trade for All partners, which include, as you know, WTO and Enhanced Integrated Framework, among others. Just want to end with 2 slides here about the upcoming e-commerce week that will happen in the last week of April, which will this year focus on data and digitalization for development. It will be in hybrid mode, so many sessions will be purely virtual, but some sessions will also be taking place physically in the Palais des Nations. We have received a large number of proposals from our partners and from member countries, and also from the private sector and civil society. You'll see here that we have more than 130 proposals submitted online. 1/3 of them came from our E-Trade for All partners. And a number of member states are listed here to the right. And we are right now finalizing the selection of the proposals. And if you have submitted and you haven't heard from us yet, you should be hearing from us very, very soon. I hope that you will all be able to join us. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Torbjörn, for that excellent overview. One of the takeaways that I absorbed from that presentation is in terms of the impact of COVID on ICT goods and services. So what seems to be coming out from that initial overview of trade flows is that the pandemic really further strengthened the comparative advantage of those sort of narrow range of large suppliers of ICT goods. But the picture for ICT-enabled services is perhaps a bit more diverse, and it seems to have changed the shares of trade, but perhaps the increase the exports of most of those engaged in ICT services. Is that a fair takeaway, Torbjörn?
I think that's a good observation. I think what it highlights the risk here that when we want digitalization to be the great equalizer, it is currently not happening that way. There is a big risk also that digitalization will be leading to even more inequalities and divides, and this is what we need to fight against, including through Aid for Trade.
Thanks very much. And in that presentation, you clearly alluded to that divide, both between countries, also between large and small firms, and also at a gender level, which I think are very useful insights that we can now allow Mark Williams, who is the practice manager for global knowledge and expertise in the digital development global practice at the World Bank. So, Mark, would you like to further build on those insights and give us the bank's view on the topic of digital connectivity and economic diversification? So, thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much. So just let me check if you can see the slides.
Can indeed.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And well, it's been a fascinating couple of presentations so far. What I'm going to do in my slides in my talk is going to talk a little bit about some of the research the bank's been doing, some of the more applied end of it, so looking at individual countries and the impacts of digital. I'm also going to talk a bit more about broaden the agenda a little bit to cover economic diversification more broadly, rather than just focusing just on the trade points. And then I'm going to talk at the end just very briefly about the way the World Bank's approaching the digital development agenda in the support that it's providing to our client countries. And it'll touch on several of the themes that have already come up along the way. Okay, so first of all, the pandemic. This has come up a couple of times in the presentation so far, and the pandemic has had a striking impact on digital and the way digital is being used. So we've heard about the impacts on trade. If you look domestically and what the effect of the pandemic has been on digital, we've seen a strong uptake in the use of digital services within countries. And then we've also seen a shift from governments moving their services online. So the pattern that we've seen in high-income countries of remote working and remote education, remote healthcare and things like that has actually been replicated to an extent in developing countries as well. And you see a broad range of experiences, but you do see quite significant shifts to online service delivery of public services. And the emerging research, and it's early for this, early days, but the emerging research is indicating that countries that were already had substantial digital infrastructure and had already prepared for online, or gone some way down the path of online service delivery, were able to respond to the pandemic quicker and more effectively, and as a result, suffered less in terms of GDP loss. And I make the point both on the infrastructure side, but also on the services side, and I'll come back to that at several points during the presentation. It's not just about networks and connectivity, it's also about usage, both on the consumer side and also on the provider side. And really the pandemic is highlighted trends which are actually been in place for much longer period of time. So you see now quite a body of evidence relating digital connectivity and digital usage with productivity and economic growth more generally, and also increases at the household level, increases in welfare as a result of people getting access to digital services. Jobs, there is an impact on jobs, both, I mean, there is the impact of digital overall on the job market is complex, obviously, and we're seeing some jobs being replaced and changed, but we're also seeing jobs created. And in developing countries, there is evidence that some digital is driving some job creation. And of course, there's big differences across regions, as we've heard already. So digital technologies are driving strong economic growth trends in Asia, as we've heard. So ICT goods production has been a big factor of that, but also ICT services and ICT-enabled services in the region are driving significant economic growth. An interesting feature of digital technologies, which we haven't heard much about so far, is about the role of digital in sustainability and resilience. So on the resilience side, I think the pandemic is an extreme example, but it's actually reflects a broader point about digital technologies being part of national strategies to create more resilience. That's more resilient economies, but it's also more resilience at the household level. You see digital payment systems being, for example, being used to send relief payments post-pandemic and post-natural disasters. And governments are looking at digital as part of a broader economic resilience strategy overall. Also on the sustainability and climate change side, the relationship between digital and climate change is also complex. On the one hand, you're seeing digital technologies growing dramatically around the world, both in terms of the hardware and all the services, which is driving increases in energy consumption, and therefore that has greenhouse gas emissions implications. But you're also seeing a trend in the opposite direction of quite significant improvements in efficiency in telecom service, digital service delivery networks, and also a shift to renewables. So the emissions pattern from the ICT production of hardware and services is a complex pattern with two trends moving in opposite directions. But the other aspect of digital and climate change and other areas of sustainability is around the ability of digital technologies to support climate change strategies in other sectors. So we see, for example, digital playing quite a key role in energy networks to manage both demand and supply sides, and also to introduce new lower emissions technologies such as small-scale renewable into grids. So how do we see digital, what's it broad conceptually, how do we see the role of digital in economic development, diversification, and also at inclusivity and impacts at the household level? Well, first of all, there's the availability is at the top of the furthest up this chain. And the availability of networks, the availability of services, but also the economic terms on which those services are made available. So the price of services and the price of devices, the ability of users to be able to access them effectively. And we've heard a bit already about skills, but this is a key issue. Skills and digital literacy is one of the primary constraints once one's gone past physical availability of the networks. So it's digital literacy and skills, along with affordability, as the two primary constraints on the adoption of and effective usage of digital technologies. So that's on the availability side. And then it's the degree to which businesses and individuals are able to use those digital technologies productively is a key driver of the outcomes. There is a difference in the economic implications, both at firm and household level, between narrow uses of digital, relatively superficial impacts on businesses' productivity and individual households, all the way through to much deeper integration of digital technology into their processes. And that ultimately feeds through into impacts both at the aggregate level and distributional. Now, there's emerging evidence from around the developing world around the impact of this. There's obviously methodological complexities around causality, but there's an emerging body of work at both macro level and also at household level around the impacts of digital technologies on labour markets, on inclusion, and on welfare. This is data from a forthcoming research on digital in Africa from the World Bank, which is showing the positive relationship between digital technology usage and labour market participation and so on. Similarly with SMEs, and what we see in the adoption of digital technologies in many African countries is that you see strong heterogeneity in the patterns of adoption. So heterogeneity at the country level, you see wide variations across countries. You also see it within countries between small, medium, and large companies. You also see relatively, at the aggregate level, you see relatively narrow uses of digital in businesses. You see it relatively superficial, so they're not having deeper effects on firm productivity, but you are seeing a trend upwards, which was pushed forward by the pandemic in firms adopting deeper forms of digital technologies into their businesses. But despite the immediate economic effects, beneficial economic effects of digital technologies, you're actually seeing the gaps increasing in terms of the usage gaps increasing. Now, this is partly a function of the rollout of networks. So you're getting more physical availability of broadband at the household and the firm level. And so, but usage is not keeping up with the rollout. So you're seeing a bigger gap between where digital technologies are available and the extent to which they're being used. And you see that at the national level, and you see it at the country level, strong disparities between urban and rural in availability and usage. You're also seeing large variations in affordability across regions, and also within countries, digital technology affordability, which is a function of both prices and ability to pay. You're also seeing strong disparities, particularly between rural and urban. So what does that mean in terms of investment requirements? Well, the ITU published a figure of just over 400 billion for a basic 4G broadband network coverage. We'll be releasing a report shortly around 5G, and the investment requirements for 5G are very significant. Depending on which model of 5G is rolled out, you see very significant dollar amounts being required, and most of that will be delivered by the private sector, but it'll take time for those to roll out. So you're going to see a widening gap globally between the 5G countries with 5G rollout and those that haven't, as high-income countries accelerate while developing countries lag behind. Moving to the East Asia Pacific region, just as an alternative contrasting example, in EAP, most countries have already bridged the coverage divide. So you're seeing the high proportion of the populations in most countries actually with access to broadband. You still see significant usage gaps in many countries, largely as a function of income, but also of price, where you see quite significant variations in price across countries. As you can see here in the AP, the cost of a 1.5 gigabytes of mobile broadband as a percentage of GNI per capita as an indicator of affordability varies very dramatically across the region. And that explains the usage gaps in large part, along with the literacy points that I mentioned. Similarly, around data safeguards, as the agenda moves just from basic connectivity through to data, you see data regulation becoming a key constraint on government's abilities to use data effectively in the economy and the government. And you see quite a wide pattern of regulatory frameworks around data across the region, with actually more focus on enablers and safeguards. And similarly, if you compare EAP with other parts of the world, you see a different pattern of the balance between data enablers and safeguards. That's all from the recent WDR report on data, WDR 21. So that's the pattern of digital adoption and use that we see across developing countries. Now, how's the World Bank responding? Well, the first point is to say that the World Bank's digital agenda, so how we see the digital economy and what we're doing to respond to it, has evolved quite significantly over the last 10 years. And we see the role of digital growing in our client countries. We've seen the impacts, again, at the macro level, but we're also seeing it at household level in all of the channels that I've mentioned. And we're seeing that evolution is not slowing down in any way. We're seeing new technologies coming in, which are potentially quite significant in terms of the impact they're going to have. Cloud computing is one example. The cloud model is redesigning the patterns of data flows, both within countries and within regions and globally. And we expect that to continue and actually deepen as customers shift towards a cloud model. And that's driving investments in infrastructure. It's also driving patterns of development, with most developing countries not having direct access to cloud infrastructure and therefore relying more on international connectivity than they have done in the past. And so the World Bank has stepped back a couple of years ago to look at these patterns of development in the digital economy and thinking about how they should respond. And this image here of the house is a simple way of thinking about the way we approach it now, which is to think of the digital economy as in a holistic way. Think about the foundational layers ranging from infrastructure through to skills, and then applications being built on top of that. So for countries to have successful digital strategies and for the World Bank to be able to support them effectively, they need to be able to think of digital in the round rather than individual segments of it. And we see that in practical terms through our analytical work at the country level, where we take that holistic framework and we look at countries across all of those pillars. And that way you can develop a more holistic and interconnected view of what's needed for digital development, where the priorities are and what the barriers to growth are across the digital economy. And we've rolled that successfully across Africa and South Asia. We're also doing it in Latin America and East Asia and Pacific. And the result has been strong demand amongst developing countries for more digital projects, or more focus, more investments in digital, both infrastructure and services. We see a significant growth over the last few years across the World Bank as a whole. So not just led by the department that I work in, which is the digital development bit, but also across all of our sectoral colleagues and sectoral units are integrating more and more digital into their projects. And we see no sign of that growth slowing down. In fact, we expect it to accelerate over the next few years. So to summarize, thinking about where does the World Bank now, how does it look at the digital development agenda? Well, first of all, thinking about digital beyond just connectivity, thinking about it as part of a broader sustainable and resilient strategy for client countries. Thinking about the conclusions and the insights from WDR21, and thinking about how we can move from just connectivity through to data and the ecosystem of rules, regulations, and infrastructure that determine how data is used. Thinking about digital foundations across all of those elements that I mentioned, going from digital infrastructure all the way through to skills, but also including things like digital financial services, digital ID. Those are the foundational elements which countries build their successful digital development strategies on. And then fourthly, the trust agenda, which is extremely important. Cybersecurity, data protection, and so on are becoming increasingly important as the world shifts to a greater online presence and people's personal data and their business processes shift more towards digital. The trust in those digital services becomes more important, and therefore governments' regulatory and related measures around those around that trust agenda move up the priority ladder. And then finally, similarly, as the world and developing countries shift online, thinking about service delivery, but also economic participation, those people who do not have access, either because they don't have physical access to networks or because they don't have effective access for one reason or another, they become increasingly disadvantaged. So closing that digital divide is becoming more and more important. And that's now a factor or an issue which is propagating throughout the World Bank's digital portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. You covered a tremendous amount of terrain in that presentation. A couple of points that sort of jumped out at me were around affordability and also the renewable energy transition. But perhaps what I'll do is ask those questions to all of our presenters, maybe coming back to you first, Mark. We're now in the Q&A phase of the workshop, and we've got about 10 minutes or so. We don't have any questions posed in the chat, so what I propose to do is to come back to you, the three speakers, Torbjorn, Mark, and Sylvia, on those two questions, and then we can come back and pick up on anything that comes up in the chat. I'd also like to give the floor to the Commonwealth Secretariat, I think Neil Batchin, to give us an overview of the reports that Neil posted links to in the chat, for which I thank him. But maybe let me just come back to Sylvia, Torbjorn and Mark, starting with Mark first around those, on those two questions. So there's a digital divide, but it seems like there's also an affordability divide. And so there, the question that I'd have for the three of you then would be thinking in terms of, you know, how can we address that? Are there trade solutions that we can think of to addressing that issue of affordability? And the other one, Mark, that you mentioned, which was tantalizing in the context of this year's global review, with regard to the digital divide, it seems like that divide can potentially also influence the rate of uptake of renewable energy, the green transition. You were talking about how those digital technologies are essential components in renewable energy grids, etc. So there, the question would be in terms of whether that digital divide can potentially also influence the rate of that green transition, that transition to renewable and clean energy solutions. So Mark, did you want to come and pick up those two questions first, and then I'll go to Sylvia and to Torbjorn. And
sure, no, happy to. So on the affordability point, first of all, you see dramatic differences in affordability between countries. Well, you see differences in prices and of course differences in incomes, which combine on the affordability point. The primary determinants of price of mobile services, so voice and data, is a combination of market structure and the effectiveness of competition, plus the underlying cost drivers within that country. And on the second of those 2 points, there's global markets and all of the inputs, the hardware inputs into mobile broadband technology. So those prices at the global level are pretty uniform. There are some differences in scale of countries and things like that, but actually a key driver of the cost of investment in a particular developing country is going to be the tax regime around import duties. And you find quite significant variations in this across different countries, but many countries, a surprising number of countries, do tax the imports of ICT hardware higher than they would expect, given the potential role of digital in in economic development and diversification. So that is a key factor on the cost side. On the market structure, there are still many countries where markets are not effectively competitive, either because there's not enough players or because their regulation is not sufficiently effective in order to drive competition. So there's a lot to be gained there. If you look at the differences in prices between markets with where you've got effective competition and those where you don't, you see quite significant differences in prices. So that's on the price side. I think on the affordability, on the demand side, clearly you've got huge disparities in incomes between low and income high households within developing countries. Also, that often coincides with rural and urban. There are some things that countries can do around that. For example, the cost of the device is actually a significant barrier on the affordability side, because there's almost no consumer credit markets for handheld device or for broadband devices in most developing countries. So the way that people in rich countries buy broadband devices or mobile phones anyway is usually on credit, one form or another, but those markets don't exist. So countries that can do things to boost those credit markets, consumer credit markets, and provide ways of improving affordability of devices, I think could go quite a long way. That's on the device side. Let me just say a few things about the green agenda before I hand over to colleagues. So on the ICT industry as a whole accounts for approximately 2 to 4% of total global emissions. I mean, there is quite a wide range of numbers, but that's the sort of center of gravity, which is actually a small but very significant contribution to emissions. And actually, because you see strongly growing volume of both goods and services in the ICT sector globally, there is the potential for that figure to increase. So I think the emissions from the ICT sector itself is a subject of which warrants attention for the future. And countries need, on the services side, mobile network operating, so on the ICT network operating side, the governments need to start thinking about this more carefully and what would be the right policy framework in order to reduce the emissions of the ICT sector in their countries. On the other aspect, which I mentioned earlier in my presentation, which is about the role of digital, I mean, if you look across most countries' mitigation and adaptation strategies, digital plays a very significant role. And if you look at NDC, the NDCs that have been submitted, digital features quite prominently in those. I mentioned energy transition, but you can also think about transport, reducing the emissions from transport infrastructure, things about more efficient mass transit, shifting to electric vehicles, road pricing, things like this, emissions monitoring. Those are all heavily reliant on digital technologies and digital infrastructure. Similarly, on the adaptation side, if we think about countries, particularly countries that are vulnerable to climate change related events, flooding, adverse weather events, digital technologies, which are highly dependent on, can be used for mitigating the effects of those, early warning systems, payment systems, emergency payment systems, and things like that, information dissemination. Those are all heavily dependent on people having effective access to broadband. Without that, those countries are really not going to be able to be as effective in implementing their adaptation strategies. So we think about digital as a kind of foundational layer that underpins most countries' develop climate change strategies in one way or another. And so I think that this is a topic which has not really been considered in any great detail. We're spending quite a lot of time and effort thinking about it, and we'll be publishing stuff on it shortly.
Thanks, Mark. That was great. Over to you, Sylvia, and then Torbjörn.
Thanks, Michael. So coming back then to the question on affordability, well, I think trade can definitely be part of the solution there, and then make this access cheaper and then more reliable by providing increased access to the ICT goods and services. We see, for instance, that many developing countries are not yet part of the information technology agreement, which can, through the tariffs that are still in place, adds to this cost of access or other remaining non-tariff barriers. And we also see through some of our work, and again, Mark was mentioning the links to the regulatory environment, where we were trying to do some correlations between the OECD Services Trade Restrictiveness Index and the cost of access to internet. And we do see that there is a role of improving that regulatory environment, telecommunications, to make the cost to internet more affordable. And maybe just lastly, coming back to one of the slides that I was showing, where we do see that there is an impact for lower and the lower middle income countries in accessing digitally deliverable services and improving productivity, because these countries have less access to these kind of services as it stands. So all these improved access through with the regulatory environment, we think that can make trade and trade policy a part of the solution to affordability.
Thank you, Sylvia. Torbjörn, would you like to comment? And maybe, I don't know whether you could also address the comment that Catalina put in the chat around access to electricity and how donor-funded projects can help cover some of the costs that might not be able to be picked up in national budgets. So sort of to plug the gap there. I suppose a gap that's also increasing with the budgetary implications of COVID too.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael. And I will perhaps add, because I agree with what has already been said about the regulatory framework side to promote competition in the market for telecom and internet services in each country, as well as the trade aspect in not imposing too high tariffs, barriers to imports of especially ICT goods, since it's very concentrated in a few countries. So most of the world's economies are actually relying heavily on imports of ICT products. But I think it is also important to keep in mind here that we don't get too focused just on the connectivity divide, which is a fundamental issue, of course. But if we end up putting all our focus on the supply of good infrastructure services and connectivity, then we may pay not enough attention to the demand side. It's very important that you see more people, more businesses making use of the internet, especially data services, if this is to generate some income also for the providers of those services. And here, this is where we come into this complex issue of digital divide. It's not just the connectivity divide, nor only the affordability divide. It relates to the skills divide, to the payments divide, to the regulatory framework divide that reduces the level of trust among users of these kind of services. We have, while we need a lot of imports in most developing countries of the ICT products, you still also need to have some domestic capabilities in the ICT services side and software development side, so that you have the skills to adapt the various solutions to the needs of the particular economy and infrastructure. There's a huge need to build awareness also, both among the governments, different ministries, as well as among the business sector, as well as among citizens in general, starting from schools. So this is where we have this cross-cutting huge challenge to bring more countries up to speed in knowing how to take advantage of digital solutions. And we have some examples of LDCs in Africa where you have almost 100% coverage of 4G mobile broadband. You have maybe 20% internet users and maybe 2% that are actually buying things online. And this really illustrates that there are different levels of the divides. So we increasingly need to focus not just on the access and use of these ICT solutions, but increasingly also on how to produce and add value use in this new world. Otherwise, it's not going to be sustainable to promote digitalization as we move forward. And Aid for Trade and other donors will have a tremendously important role to support, especially those countries that are the least prepared still for the digital transition that we are facing right now globally. So Catalina's questions is highly relevant. The electricity aspect is one infrastructure factor that has to be addressed. And probably Mark is better equipped to respond to this, because I think the World Bank is a very important player in supporting the improvement of the power infrastructure among developing countries.
Thanks very much. Now, time is running away from us. I did say that I would give the floor to Neil at the Commonwealth to give us just a very brief introduction of the allusion to the papers that he posted in the chat. So Neil, if you're still online, if you'd like to come in there. I saw also that there were a couple of hands that went up while the various speakers were responding to the questions that I posed. If you'd like to pose questions in the chat, please do so, and then I'm sure that our speakers can come back on those. But there have been various references to ICT skills in LDCs, and we have somebody who's perfectly placed to respond to that issue coming up in the next session. So let's not keep him waiting too much longer. So Neil, over to you. If you can just introduce those papers in 60 seconds or less. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to take the floor. I'll be very brief. I'm Neil Belchin. I'm an economic advisor in our international trade policy team. And I just wanted to highlight 3 recent publications which I think will be of great interest given the subject of this workshop. The first is our flagship 2021 Commonwealth Trade Review, which has been out for a while now, and I've posted a link in the chat if you would like to have a look at it. And one of the main themes of that review is on digital trade, and it includes a chapter that focuses specifically on digital trade in the Commonwealth. So please do have a look at that if you're interested. And the other one, which I think is especially of interest to this subject, is a recent publication that outlines a concept of aid for digital trade and proposes a newly invigorated agenda in this area, as well as some initial focus areas where this aid for digital trade concept could, initially take shape. And the final one is a forthcoming publication, which the link should be out in the next couple of weeks, and that looks at capacity building in digital economy agreements and specifically makes a case for greater capacity building provisions in such agreements, either existing ones or ones that might be negotiated in the future. And I'll just end off by saying that digital trade is a core element of our new strategic plan at the Commonwealth. So we do hope to have a lot more output and engagement in this area in the next few months and next few years. So I look forward to working with all of you on that in particular. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And thanks to the speakers also for some really informative presentations.
Thank you, Neil, for doing that so quickly. I also see in the chat that the STDF has posted something around a session that they will be organizing at the e-commerce week. More publicity for Torbjorn's event, which is great. And talking about the e-certification, so those digital trade procedures that that Sylvia and Torbjorn and Mark were mentioning in the previous session. So let us now move on to session 2, and let me thank Sylvia, Mark, and Torbjorn for their participation today. Do please stay on if you can, and as I mentioned, if anybody wants to ask questions about their presentations, do feel free to do so in the chat. Or to send them an email. So let us now move over to this second section on practice perspectives. And let me welcome the speakers. Our first speaker from Madagascar is Gil Raza Fin Salama, who is chair of the board of directors of the ESTI, which is a college of higher education college of information technology. And he is an expert consultant in digital development and e-commerce. Monsieur Raza Fin Salama, vous êtes le bienvenu. And speaking alongside him, we will have Paz Velasco Velazquez, who is the section leader for the investment, climate and trade at the, and also responsible for microeconomic analysis and investment climate. And for private sector trade and employment at the European Commission. And also Pramila Crivelli, who is an economist and the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department at the Asian Development Bank. And thank you, Pramila, for agreeing to step into the free slot at such short notice. It's going to be, I'm sure, a very interesting presentation that you will give. But our first speaker is Gil, and in Madagascar's response to the this year's Aid for Trade monitoring exercise, there were some very interesting comments that were made about how digital connectivity was offering opportunities for MSMEs and for young people. But obviously that depends on the ICT training and skills. So Gil, I think you are extremely well placed to discuss that topic. Alors, donc je vous donne la parole. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour mesdames et messieurs. Donc effectivement, je vais vous parler du commerce numérique à Madagascar. Je vais en parler en fait sur à peu près sur 3 axes. Je vais diviser un peu mon écran. Voilà. Je vais en parler sur 3 axes. 3 grands chantiers en fait du développement du numérique à Madagascar aujourd'hui, qui sont la gouvernance, les services numériques et numérisés, et évidemment la formation et le renforcement de compétences. Mais auparavant, je vais faire un petit point sur la vision de Madagascar sur le numérique. Malheureusement, Madagascar n'a pas encore de politique nationale pour le développement du numérique. Toutefois, dans le programme du président, notamment, on peut parler de l'initiative Madagascar. J'ai un écho. Initiative pour l'émergence de Madagascar. Il y a un gros faire de Madagascar un pays leader en matière de services liés au TIC. Et dans son engagement numéro 11, dans le chapitre la modernisation de Madagascar,
Est-ce que
il y a
je peux juste interrompre une seconde parce que là, la qualité de l'audio qu'on reçoit à chez nous n'est pas top. Donc, ça pose un petit problème pour les interprètes. Donc, est-ce que je peux peut-être suggérer à ce que vous fermez la caméra et peut-être ça va améliorer la qualité de la présentation. Excusez-moi pour ça. En espérant que ça améliore la présentation.
je viens de fermer mon parce que je ah. J'espère que ça va aller mieux. Vous m'entendez? C'est bon?
Voilà, on reçoit la présentation. Donc, si vous pouvez réessayer, on va voir ce qu'on peut faire. Merci.
D'accord. Okay. Donc, je disais donc que j'allais faire ma présentation sur trois chantiers principalement du développement du numérique à Madagascar. C'est celui de la e-gouvernance, le développement des services numériques et numérisés et la formation et le renforcement de compétences. Mais auparavant, je vais vous présenter la vision de Madagascar par le numérique. C'est vrai que Madagascar n'a pas de politique nationale pour le développement du numérique. Jusqu'à présent, la dernière politique nationale date de 2005. Mais dans la vision du président, notamment l'initiative d'émergence de Madagascar, il y a un gros chapitre sur le faire de Madagascar un pays leader en matière de services numériques. Dans le 11e engagement du président, il y a un chapitre qui s'appelle la modernisation de Madagascar et qui inclut en fait de nombreuses actions sur le développement du numérique. Et dans le plan émergence de Madagascar, il y a le plan de mise en œuvre de la vision. Vous m'entendez?
Absolument, oui. Allez-y.
D'accord. Il y a la priorité 22, rendre Madagascar un acteur de la révolution numérique. La priorité 26, qui est disposer d'infrastructures de communication moderne. La priorité 28, sur le renforcement de l'énergie et de l'accès à l'énergie. Et enfin, la priorité 32, qui concerne les changements climatiques. J'ai un retour de, je ne sais pas, il faut peut-être éteindre le micro de la salle. J'ai un retour, en fait, c'est pour ça que ça perturbe. Bon, je continue. Hein, si...
Allez-y, allez-y.
Ok, alors je parlais de contexte, hein, très rapidement, en fait, le contexte de l'infrastructure à Madagascar. Madagascar, aujourd'hui, est couvert par 64% par des réseaux. C'est vraiment embêtant, ce côté. Vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Ok. Alors, Madagascar est couvert à 64% par des réseaux, donc fibre optique, 3G, 4G. Et aujourd'hui, on a démarré la 5G. On est relié à des fibres optiques sous-marines, notamment ici, Safe à travers Lyon 2, et bientôt tout Africa et le Métis. Et le télécommunication à Madagascar représente 1,8% du PIB, soit 270 millions de dollars. Notre taux de pénétration Internet, l'autorité de régulation en 2019, était de 11,6%. Et le taux de pénétration du PIB, 45,6%. Nous avons développé des applications, en plus donc, de la loi qui existait déjà depuis 2005 sur les télécommunications éthiques. Nous avons développé avec la FIDITI, nous avons d'abord créé un comité de pilotage pour le développement du commerce électronique. Ça a permis de développer la loi du commerce électronique, qui sont la signature électronique, les transactions électroniques, la cybercriminalité, la protection de données à caractère personnel, et qui ont été suivis de principales sur le paiement, qui sont la loi de l'économie électronique et la nouvelle loi bancaire. Donc ça se concerne l'économie numérique. Et pour l'économie numérisée, nous avons développé une loi qui s'appelle la loi pour la garantie et la protection des consommateurs, spécifiquement pour le consommateur du numérique, et la loi sur la communication. Enfin, en ce qui concerne le contexte, nous avons un taux de pénétration de 38% sur le téléphone mobile, ce qui fait à peu près 10 millions d'utilisateurs actifs. Nous avons 3 millions et plus d'utilisation, 3 millions 200 un peu moins d'utilisateurs de Facebook en 2022, ce qui fait à peu près 11% de la population. Les métiers aujourd'hui, selon une étude de 2020, les métiers les plus en vogue auprès des entreprises aujourd'hui, le développement du site. On a une collectivité qui est chère. Notre coût de connexion est de $3 à $40 le giga par mois. Ce qui est bien, en fait, j'ai sorti ici un tableau qui donne très bien cette position de prix par rapport aux autres pays. Donc, c'est un tarif élevé. Nous avons 23 000 travailleurs en formel et 85 000 travailleurs dans l'informel. Je vais vous dire j'ai dit ça là. Pourquoi est-ce que j'ai mis ces chiffres sur l'informel et sur Facebook? Et ces travailleurs sont surtout en web, la rédaction, la traduction, le design, le graphisme, et dans des métiers un peu plus pointus qui sont la SEO, le social engine optimization. Enfin, tous les métiers qui sont liés en fait à la science de données. Le chiffre d'affaires du secteur est aujourd'hui à 417,5 millions de dollars et 76% de ce évidemment, c'est les opérateurs télécoms. Et les BPO représentent que 17% de services numériques. Bon, voilà le contexte. Maintenant, je vais vous dire ce qu'on fait à peu près à Madagascar dans les 3 chantiers dont j'ai parlé tout à l'heure, notamment la e-gouvernance. Madagascar donc, avait déjà une gouvernance de mais cette politique a été reprise par l'actuel gouvernement. Ils ont créé une unité de gouvernance digitale en partenariat avec la Banque mondiale, dont les principales missions, c'est la mise en place d'une infrastructure d'échange d'Hydrode, qui est la solution estonienne de développement d'infrastructures, et la modernisation de l'état civil de gestion d'identité. L'idée étant de donner une identité unique à chaque malgache et sa naissance. La e-gouvernance a aussi réalisé des procédures. Ils ont créé pour cela e-wallet, qui est un portefeuille électronique de la poste. E-hit, le paiement des impôts par et aujourd'hui, la Banque centrale, sur une monnaie électronique qui est le IRR. Le gouvernement a aussi mis en place, est en train de mettre en place la IFITO, la dématérialisation des procédures sanitaires et phytosanitaires en partenariat avec le GAF, la Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. Et Madagascar aussi est en train de mettre en place des procédures de décision anticipée. Donc, ce sont des procédures qui permettent à ceux qui font des transactions d'importation ou d'exportation de connaître les procédures et surtout ceux qui doivent payer avant de l'envoi de la marchandise. Donc, cette procédure est en train de mise en place. La mise en place est portée d'informations. Enfin, il y a d'autres actions. Ça fait la mise à disposition du public de hotspot et la facilitation de l'accès aux énergies renouvelables, aux énergies solaires. Étant donné les nombres de coupures qu'il y a à Madagascar aujourd'hui en raison des difficultés de l'entreprise principale productrice d'énergie, le gouvernement incite à l'utilisation de l'énergie solaire. Enfin, pour les services numériques et numérisés, nous avons une grosse évolution du e-commerce, effectivement. Bon, nous avons élaboré donc, avec la ficelle de notre état de préparation au commerce électronique de 2017. Ensuite, il y a eu une forte augmentation. J'ai mis un graphique à côté, là, en bas, qui montre qu'en 2020 et 2021, il y a eu 23,7% d'augmentation, 10,7% d'augmentation des usagers de réseaux sociaux, de Facebook, pour ne pas le nommer, et aujourd'hui est très utilisé pour le commerce. Ce n'est pas l'idéal de faire du commerce électronique, mais en tout cas, comme c'est très pratique pour les utilisateurs, ben, c'est aujourd'hui très utilisé. Il y a aussi une augmentation du nombre de fintech. La loi n'est pas encore tout à fait claire sur les fintech, mais il y a de nombreuses entreprises qui se sont créées de fintech. Et il y a aussi aujourd'hui des sont légales. Une première a été de e-commerce a été financée par un financement participatif qui s'appelle Miraka. Donc, il a réussi à lever un fonds à Miraka. Il y a une augmentation des livraisons dans tout le pays, notamment pour la livraison de médicaments, étant donné l'état des routes. Et une augmentation, comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure, de l'utilisation de l'énergie solaire. Il y a des sociétés privées aussi vu le jour. Ça, c'est pour les e-commerce. Maintenant, sur le cadre réglementaire, sur les services numériques et numérisés, nous sommes en train de travailler sur l'accréditation des organismes de signature électronique. Nous avons déjà la loi, mais il nous faut maintenant sortir le décret d'accréditation des organismes de signature électronique, et ce n'est pas encore fait. Parallèlement à ça, nous sommes travaillés sur la ratification de la Convention des Nations Unies sur l'utilisation des communications électroniques dans les contrats internationaux que nous avons déjà signés, mais qu'il nous faut maintenant ratifier. Nous travaillons sur la mise en place de la CIT, l'organe de sécurité, de cybersécurité de l'État. Ce n'est pas encore en place. Il y a une équipe pré-opérationnelle qui a été mise en place et ils sont en train de travailler sur la vision et la stratégie de la cybersécurité à Madagascar aujourd'hui. Nous sommes en train de sortir aussi le décret de mise en place de la CNIL, la Commission malgache informatique et liberté, donc le décret important pour la protection des données personnelles. Nous travaillons aussi sur le renforcement de notre institution d'appui au commerce électronique, le CPDCE, et nous travaillons également sur le renforcement de la traçabilité locale des livraisons postales, puisque ça, c'est un gros écueil de commerce électronique, cette histoire de traçabilité des livraisons. Quels sont aujourd'hui les freins que nous décelons en fait pour le développement du secteur du Madagascar? C'est d'abord l'absence de politique et de développement du numérique et l'absence de politique pour le commerce électronique et de stratégie pour le commerce électronique. Le problème de compétences a été très évoqué et nous témoignons de ce gros problème, on en parlait tout à l'heure. La faiblesse de dynamisation, la faiblesse de la banque de développer le secteur, ou alors peut-être un manque de moyens, mais en tout cas, une insuffisance de dynamisation du secteur du gouvernement sur le développement. La faiblesse du cadre réglementaire, ce qu'on a fait en 2014, une fiscalité n'est pas excessive, en fait, il n'y a pas de politique fiscale numérique. Ça, en fait, il y a des taxes qui sont générées et qui perturbent le fonctionnement des entreprises. D'accès aux marchés nationaux et internationaux et difficulté d'accès aux équipements, aux infrastructures pour les entreprises. Après la Covid, en fait, on a constaté que seuls 8% des entreprises ont commencé à augmenter l'utilisation des plateformes numériques. Les modes de paiement électronique n'intéressent que 16% des entreprises et 33% des entreprises ont intégré ont adopté le télétravail. Ce qui est vraiment insuffisant pour développer le secteur. Et enfin, 45,3% des entreprises prévoient une dégradation de leur, chiffre d'affaires entre 25% et... en fait, le conseil, c'est de dire que, en fait, malheureusement, après la Covid, c'est vrai que la Covid a eu un impact très important sur le développement du numérique, mais c'est surtout le secteur informel, à cause de Facebook, qui en a bénéficié. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a eu beaucoup de propositions de services à travers les réseaux sociaux et qui, malheureusement, n'ont pas vraiment bénéficié du pays. C'est fait vraiment de manière celui qui commande et celui qui achète et celui qui vend. Donc voilà, c'est peut-être le constat que je peux faire ici par rapport à la situation post-Madagascar. Je ne sais pas si c'est le cas partout, mais en tout cas, l'impact de la Covid, ça a été sur. Et enfin, troisième chantier sur lequel il faut qu'on travaille aussi, c'est la formation et le renforcement de compétences. Nous avons un déficit croissant de compétences dans le numérique. Nous avions déjà en fait des soucis entre les entreprises, les compétences, les projets, les grands projets d'appui, on vous a une compétence qui prennent comme il n'y en a pas sur le marché, ben, ils prennent sur les entreprises. La e-gouvernance, le développement de la e-gouvernance a besoin aussi de compétences. Donc ils prennent ils sont en compétition avec les entreprises. Et à ces trois constats vient s'ajouter un quatrième aujourd'hui, l'informel. En fait, les compétences, au lieu d'aller en entreprise, ils répondent directement à des marchés. Ils restent en informel et puis, en fait, donc, ils ne sont pas en entreprise. Donc, ce qui fait que ce déficit s'accroît. Nous avons des difficultés à avoir des compétences, des difficultés aussi à avoir des formateurs de qualité, notamment dans des secteurs évolués. Donc, chez moi, par exemple, on a besoin de data scientists ou des compétences dans la cybersécurité. C'est très difficile parce qu'on n'en a pas sur place et même à l'extérieur, auquel ils ont aussi du mal. Les besoins des entreprises de services numériques aujourd'hui sont à peu près de 1000 ingénieurs par an. Quand je dis ingénieur, c'est du master 2. Or, l'offre 1210 est master 2 confondu. Donc, elle est totalement insuffisante aux besoins. Nous avons créé, 3 ans maintenant, le fonds Malgache pour la formation professionnelle, un fonds alimenté par 1% de la masse salariale. Commence à répondre à peu près aux besoins, mais encore attendre pour avoir des compétences. Il y a aussi l'augmentation des centres de formation, grâce à ça d'ailleurs, grâce à la mise en place du centre de formation. Il n'empêche que les formateurs, heureusement, on a certains partenaires qui ont un de renforcement des formations dans leur programme, notamment l'Union européenne, la Banque mondiale, ont intégré en fait des programmes de renforcement des formations dans leur programme. Donc, j'espère que ça va pouvoir aider le secteur. Et nous avons développé le modèle d'apprentissage par alternance pour que les compétences soient le plus rapidement possible sur le marché. Voilà un peu ce que je voulais vous partager aujourd'hui. Pour conclure, en fait, donc je voudrais insister sur le fait que la Covid a contribué à développer l'informel. Donc, il faudrait donc travailler sur une facilitation de l'accès des entreprises, notamment les PME formelles. Les stratégies de Madagascar pour le développement du numérique et du commerce électronique devraient être lancées. Le développement effectif reste une condition incontournable. Il ne suffit pas, en fait, d'avoir des compétences techniques. Il faut s'orienter vers les produits. Et en fait, le corollaire de ce que je dis en quatrième point, c'est qu'il faut harmoniser les utilisations pour le secteur des biens ou des services productifs. Autrement, on n'arrivera pas, à développer le numérique. Le coût de télécommunication, par exemple, est très dépendant du nombre d'utilisateurs. Or, nous n'avons pas d'utilisateurs avec un pouvoir d'achat suffisant pour utiliser l'infrastructure. Donc, le coût ne fait pas, a du mal à baisser. Voilà, mesdames et messieurs, ce que je voulais vous partager. Je suis à votre disposition si vous avez des questions.
Je vous remercie beaucoup, Monsieur Raza Fin Salama. Comme vous avez remarqué, on avait des problèmes à suivre vu la connexion. Donc, ce que je vais faire, c'est de juste faire un petit résumé en anglais de ce que vous avez nous transmis. Normalement, vous devriez avoir la possibilité de l'écouter en français. So, thank you very much for that overview. I thought you gave an excellent presentation on where Madagascar is in terms of its vision and the implementation of the digital economy. You talked about in the slides that we will put up on the website about how Madagascar has been connected in terms of hard infrastructure through undersea cabling, and how that has been then further developed in domestic infrastructure. And the government, you outlined also the government's vision of the digital economy and how that's being translated into action. And some of the things that I took away from that were that government services, provision of e-government services, is playing a very important role in terms of the development of ICT services at a domestic level. And also, so there's a sort of should we say, a push there in terms of the e-government services provided by the government of Madagascar, and a pull factor as well in terms of social media such as Facebook, etc., which is tempting people online. And obviously, you talked also about the impact that COVID has had there with COVID, the various lockdowns encouraging people and firms to go online through teletravail, through remote working. But also that would being a double-edged sword with more than 40% of firms reporting a decrease in their sales of anywhere between 25 and 50%. And how the government is working across a number of areas, government and development partners, to try to address some of the shortcomings in terms of the development of the market. In particular, you mentioned the issue of e-payments, which is not very well developed. And then in the final slides, you talked about the needs in terms of human capital, in terms of ICT services and the number of software engineers, etc., and how you were receiving support from some donors on that, including the Agence Française de Développement and the European Union. So do please feel free to post anything that you think I might have missed. If you want to post something in the chat, or if you want to come in during the question and answer, do please feel free to correct anything I may have said or further develop it. But since you mentioned the support that you're receiving from the European Union, I think now is a perfect moment to pass the floor over to Paz Velasco Velaquez, who will be talking in more detail about the EU's Aid for Trade and talking how digitalization and e-commerce is being used as part of that strategy. So Paz, you have the floor. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Let me try to share my screen. Can you now see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good, excellent. Excellent. So as I said, it's on display mode. Hang on a second. Yes. So my name is Paz Velasco. I'm the head of sector for investment, climate and trade in the Directorate General for International Partnership in the European Commission. I'm very happy to be here with you today and to be able to discuss digitalization as a key priority and economic diversification. For us, just a brief summary of where we stand. This represent what is aid for trade, volumes of aid for trade for the European Commission and the European Union and its 27 member states. As you see here, we remain the biggest donor of aid for trade worldwide, and for the last year for which data is available, 2019, we disbursed with our 27 member states almost 18 billion euros in aid for trade. This is in addition to the importance of the EU as a trading partner for many developing countries, for which the EU stands for a significant share of both imports and exports. It also means that we have a unique responsibility to help developing countries bridge the digital divide. So it's not only that we are the biggest donor, it's also that we have the obligation to be there and to work together with partner countries. For the Commission, digitalization is a key priority for us. It's one of the 6 priorities of the current European Commission that will go up to 2024. And also in the context of our development cooperation, what we call the Global Europe Regulation, that sets the principle and priorities and the budgetary allocation for the next 7 years period until 2027. Digitalization also comes high in the agenda. We say that we shall promote the use of digitalization as a powerful enabler for sustainable development and inclusive growth. Also, in the programming documents that we establish, so we have the general regulations setting the biggest priorities, but we also have programming documents defining the priorities and the main areas of action with our partner countries and partner regions. And in this is what we call the multi-annual indicative programs. We also see that the digitalization is featuring 80% of our programming documents. Finally, we have just launched the Global Gateway, where we are foreseeing an investment of 300 billion euros in 5 key infrastructure areas, where digital connectivity is one of them. We see also that digitalization is a key factor in our aid for trade policy. We see that one key current trend is the rise of the global and regional value chain, with international production networks based increasingly on inter-firm and intra-firm trade. We see there is a growing importance of services in international trade, and digitalization is shaping the global economy in new ways, many of which are still yet to be uncovered. A major challenge is, however, that many developing countries, and we have seen this with the with the COVID pandemic, many developing countries' participation in global value chain and digitalization has continued to remain marginal. We see digitalization as an enabling factor for accessing external markets and for integration into the global value chain. We have already demonstrated how digital innovation has a strong potential to offer solutions to local problems, to reduce trade costs, and to offer new business opportunity. For us, the EU Aid for Trade aims to encourage investment in digital technologies and services, to improve computerization, e-government and e-commerce logistics, and finally to provide technical assistance for governments and also for other stakeholders to establish policies and favorable frameworks to cross-border commerce. Coming back to the pandemic, we have seen how the pandemic and the homeschooling, teleworking, and the lockdowns, the many lockdowns across the world, we have seen how it has accelerated the demand for digital trade facilitation measures for SMMEs to enter e-commerce platforms, and also for logistics and supply chain improvements. We have put in place many of our EU Aid for Trade programs. We have put them in place to be amended and to be able to adapt to the new challenges that the pandemic brought to us in 2020. Some of the examples, for example, we have recently approved the Digital for Development. This is, I will explain a bit more in detail about that in the next slides. But also specific programs like, for example, leveraging digital finance to increase resilience of ACP countries, where we are deploying digital finance solution for to accelerate economic recovery from COVID-19. In Indonesia, for example, we have the Arise Plus Indonesia Trade Support Facility that is supporting the engagement with the private sector through the establishment of an electronic interface for ASEAN businesses councils. And for example, in Central America, just to give you another example, we have the Central American Regional Integration, Economic Integration in TEC, with 21 million euros. That includes capacity building and technical assistance for private and public sector and regional institutions to take advantage of the EU Central America Association Agreement. And there is a direct support to the private sector development of the digital platform for trade in Central America. I was mentioning before our flagship initiative on digital is the Digital for Development platform. It was launched in December 2020 as a global multi-stakeholder platform, and it marks a turning point in the European Union's international partnership to support a human-centric and green digital transformation. Here, with the digital D4D, we try to aim at a multitude digital initiatives by European actors for unparalleled coordinated impact. To this date, we have 11 EU member states that have signed a letter of intent to participate in the D4D hub, such as Germany, Belgium, France, Estonia, Luxembourg, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, the Netherlands, Lithuania, and Finland. We see that we have built this D4D in 4 pillars: governance, including policy regulatory frameworks and data protection; digital connectivity, including key enabling infrastructure, such as power and broadband; e-services, both addressing and tackling public and private, and including also e-governance; and skills, entrepreneurship, and access to finance. We would like to form regional branches in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, as well as in the eastern neighborhood of the European Union, including all relevant stakeholders from the respective regions. And we aim finally to create the important opportunities for employment and to pave the way for economic growth and recovery, to connect information and communication technology professional, investors, academia, incubators, authorities. We aim also at facilitating access to financing and sharing information, mutual learning from the different stakeholders. And I have to say finally that a special focus is being put into mainstreaming or ensuring reaching to youth and women. What we strive finally for the D4D is a digital transformation worldwide that is centered around people's needs and fundamental rights. We see that in the digital area, digital cooperation accelerates progress towards the Agenda 2030, so the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, through leaving no one behind by closing digital divides, including the gender digital divide. why we have launched nowadays this D4D initiative. We see today more than ever and after the pandemic how the digital technologies are transforming societies and economies around the world at a scale. And only by joining forces, we can take on these global challenges and untap the digital opportunities. We see this as a new form of global digital cooperation with the European Union. We promote with this multi-stakeholder platform, we want to promote new international partnership on digital transformation between the European Union and our partners across the world. And finally, we strive to shape a digital area that is inclusive and sustainable, so leaving no one behind, creating equal chances for everyone. We were discussing, I was mentioning before, our multi-indicative programming and how we have recently adopted the programming priorities for the next 7 years period. And here, just briefly to mention that 77% of the sub-Saharan programs, development cooperation programs that we have just approved in the last quarter of 2021, 77% of them, they have digital is somehow addressed as a priority to work with our partner countries, including digital entrepreneurship, connectivity, green e-services, and the role of the private sector. I mentioned before also the Global Gateway. This is an opportunity, this is a new strategy that we have launched to offer partner countries how to accelerate our twin transaction. It's a sustainable offer to meet infrastructure needs. And as I said before, among the 5 priority infrastructure key investment priorities in the Global Gateway, digital is one of them. It's a major infrastructure development around the world, post-COVID and post-COP26, and it will be developed through a Team Europe approach. For digital, it means that the international connectivity and connecting Europe to other countries will be prioritized. Tackling the digital divide and fostering traffic volumes among EU partner countries and regions will also be promoted. We will also work on data infrastructure and open internet, ensuring secure and free internet connectivity. We will also address at national level, national connectivity, so mostly serving the underdeserved. And we will secure and trust connectivity. So we will ensure that the safety, cybersecurity is also met. Finally, some conclusions that we can bring up to the discussion is the European Union strongly support the integration of digitalization in our aid for trade policy. And we have substantial experiences of delivering on digitalization with our partner countries. Due to the pandemic, we have strengthened our support, and we have also seen how the demand for support in digitalization has dramatically increased. However, we also see that there is, in a recent survey with our EU delegations, we have also realized that for our practitioners, for our colleagues, colleagues that are filling the report, that are in the field, and that are in direct contact with our partner countries, both from the European Commission, but also from EU member states, we have also received this result that promoting e-commerce or digitalization has been considerably important or extremely important only to 25% of the colleagues filling the survey. We have to further explore and assess this result. Our first indication is that this is mostly due to the lack of digital development with partner countries, where digitalization is still not part of the agenda of the partner country. There are not infrastructure or policy regulation that facilitate digitalization, and therefore it cannot be, or it hasn't been considered yet as an enabling factor of our aid for trade programs. So we have to first address the root causes for this digital gap, and then get or tapping into the full potential of our aid for trade programs. And finally, our last conclusion is that we need to address digitalization with an holistic approach. Bottlenecks are in a range of policy areas and also infrastructure. And we need to rely on a range of skills and thematic expertise areas that are still to be, in many cases, strengthened and further developed. And this is where our priorities will be put in place. So tackling policy reform, investment needs, and creating the skills needed to ensure digitalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paz. That was fascinating, and particularly that last slide. So one of the takeaways that I had from your presentation was how within the EU's multi-annual programming, you've made a special effort to ensure that that financing is available not just today, tomorrow, but in many years to come. But then there seems to be this. There needs to be a similar commitment on the side of the countries requesting EU support, that e-commerce, digital connectivity is also prioritized in their national development strategies, digital connectivity plans, to ensure that funding is unlocked. I guess is that a fair sort of a contradiction to highlight, and something that perhaps we need to be working on as well, in terms of working with developing country governments to ensure that there is that prioritization?
Yes, I think so. I mean, also from my personal experience in developing countries, I think this is one of the biggest issues. Sometimes we are pushing maybe too fast, or trying to move as fast as we would like countries to move, while there is still not the preparedness at the level of policy development, of skills, of investments in these countries to move as fast as we want. So there is a bit of we need to find the balance between supporting but ensuring that the different steps are being taken. We have the clear commitment from the European Union, both Commission and the EU member states, to work on this, to take a step, tailored approach to each country to ensure digitalization is achieved, to reduce the digital gap, to ensure that they deserve the vulnerable segment of the population have access to digital, so ensure equalitarian digitalization access, if we can say so, and to enable that if, hopefully not, a next pandemic comes, we will be all ready to face it from our computers at home and keep business more or less as usual. So that is our commitment. And we are putting this commitment in place both from our development cooperation programs that we have at national and regional level, but also from these more global EU strategies, such as the Digital for Development and the Global Gateway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very useful reply. Peut-être c'est une question que Monsieur Raza Finsalama voudrait aborder donc lors de la question and answer. Et là, si, comme on espère, le Covid-19 passe d'une phase de pandémie à une phase endémique, est-ce que peut-être la prioritisation au niveau national, ça va changer? Je ne sais pas, parce que là, on voit qu'il y a un soutien depuis les pays donateurs. Donc, je ne sais pas si c'est quelque chose sur lequel vous pourriez faire un commentaire. Comment est-ce qu'on peut être sûr qu'il y a cet engagement au niveau des pays partenaires, non seulement de l'Union européenne, mais d'autres donateurs aussi. Mais avant qu'on aborde cette question, let's now pass the floor even to Pramila Crivelli, who is an economist at the Asian Development Bank, working in the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. And Pramila will talk to us about how the ADB is turning its policy perspectives into practice in terms of Aid for Trade programs. So thanks very much, Pamela, again, as I said, for joining us at such short notice, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about the work of ADB in the area of Aid for Trade and digital connectivity. Yes, it was a short notice, so please understand that it will not cover all what we do at ADB, but just a brief selection of different aspects and policies that cover Aid for Trade and digital connectivity. Can you just confirm that you see the slides in full screen?
We do indeed,
mode?
thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. Oh, sorry, I have just, for some reason, I cannot. Okay. I have an issue with my own screen, but okay. So Aid for Trade agenda in ADB is included in both in corporate strategies and also in sub-regional program strategies. Today I will present briefly our corporate strategy and where you will find the Aid for Trade priorities and related also to digital connectivity. And this you will find in ADB Strategy 2030, adopted in 2018, where it includes regional cooperation and integration operational priority, which is operational priority 7. And this is the one I'm going to mostly discuss today, simply because not that other priorities do not include at all digital aspects, but simply because in the context of the WTO and the trade and Aid for Trade, this is the one that in fact covers most of the areas we are actually all interested in today. And in September 2019, ADB adopted an RCI's Regional Cooperation and Integration Operational Plan for this strategy. And the three main pillars are: first, greater and better connectivity; second, expanded global and regional trade and investment opportunities; and finally, increased and diversified regional public goods. So as you can see, connectivity is one of the main aspects of this strategy. Of course, here we do not mention specifically digital, but be sure that digital connectivity is in fact key in this pillar. In the preparation of the monitoring and evaluation exercise conducted for the global review, it was a very nice exercise because it forced us to consult also internally, because in ADB we don't have one specific division or working only on Aid for Trade or on digital connectivity, or it's all scattered throughout the organization. So we started a consultation process and just to have an idea what are the main priorities in Aid for Trade, and these are this is the main result. And as you can see, connectivity and digital connectivity is actually appearing quite a lot. In the first area, in energy transport and ICT connectivity, cross-border connectivity. Also, we have projects now on paperless trade, we have also project on trade and investments agreements. But in trade agreements, we see it as in a broad perspective, including also digital agreements, as it is a new area that also needs support. Now, most recently, a guidance note was published on fostering RCI for recovery and resilience in January 2022. And it advocates for wider and deeper RCI, identifying opportunities and emerging themes towards inclusive, sustainable, and resilient recovery. And in this note, connectivity and digital connectivity is in fact a key component. I just show you the first two main challenges that have been identified, just to highlight how digital connectivity challenges are important. So the first challenge was about digitalization and how it is challenging the conventional approaches to build human capital through education, traditional perspective on social protection, and also, most importantly, taxation and digital platforms for digital trade and for digital trade. The second part is about the work, the change that are generating cross-border demand for more secure private and public e-commerce and e-government services. I think it has been discussed in previous presentation, and also ICT platforms. So digital connectivity is at the heart of our strategy, but something that also appears in this document is the need for mainstreaming digitalization in sustainable trade. What I mean by that is that we need to adopt a holistic approach, and this document is actually very clear. Here on the screen, you see only a very a snapshot of a large matrix of different elements. And here I'll just show you a little part, including digitalization and cross-border data, where I think it's the most relevant for the topic of today. But the most important is that we would like, I think, we have to have an holistic approach, combining digitalization with sustainability of both trade and transport that have become, in fact, increasingly important and central in all ADB projects recently. I think that's the main message. In the same way, we have been talking for, these are cross-cutting issues. We have been talking for many years of how to mainstream trade in development plans. So now we're talking about how we can mainstream digitalization in trade strategies. And here I give you an example of CARAC, where so you can see that it's not only the corporate strategy that includes ICT and digitalization, but also regional strategies and national strategies supported by ADB would also include these elements as priorities. Now, we have a lot of, beyond operations, we have a lot of knowledge products and research in the area. And on screen, you see all, not all, but a selection of reports and knowledge products that have been produced by ADB in the area of technology and digital connectivities in the last years. And as you can see, there are many. Even the last Aid for Trade report in the Asia and the Pacific in 2019 was actually covering this aspect of digital connectivity and export diversification, but with a specific focus on the Pacific and gender aspects. Now we have a lot of new knowledge products, and I want to highlight just results of the last Asian Economic Integration Report 2021, which was about digital platforms. And it showed how digital platforms can contribute to sustainable development goals. So seeing that sustainable development is always at the center of our research. And as you can see in this slide, many of these elements that are cited related to digital platforms do actually relates to digital services. Financial services, health and education can be delivered also digitally. Flexible work arrangements, so work from home is also about digital, can also be related to digital services, how you deliver digital services online. And why I'm mentioning that is because this presentation gives me the opportunity to introduce our new Asian Economic Integration Report 2022, which is going to be launched on Wednesday. And you are really pretty much welcome to join the launch at 10 a.m. Manila time. And it will cover the topic of advancing digital services trade in Asia and the Pacific. So looking more specifically at those services that I was discussing earlier, and how regional cooperation and structural reforms can help Asian economies to unlock the potential of digital services. And in fact, in this report, we made an extensive use of the WHO OECD trading services databases to study the drivers of digital services trade, but also to study the impact of digital services trade. And we find out that digital services trade can in fact have a positive impact, not only on trade, but also on income and economic development in the long term. So that is the reason why we focus on this topic in this report. So you are really more than welcome to join. The last, message I want to give today is about the preparation of our next Aid for Trade report 2022 that will include chapter on the digital economy and most importantly on digital trade agreements. In fact, here I want to reflect on what has been also mentioned by the EU earlier in the presentation, that it was surprising to see that some countries do not have priority at the moment, or only 25% of the countries feel like digital economy or digital connectivity should be a need for trade priority at the moment. And here we want to look at digital agreements in the broader context of digital regulation and in fact in international trade regulations. So we look not only at digital economy, but also at how we can support countries to design trade regulations and trade agreements in general, and to make full and effective use of those trade agreements, simply because it seems that traditional issues in international trade, sometimes in the poorest economies, still needs to be in fact addressed. And we believe that we could address those together with the emerging issue of digital economy, because some elements are similar. The difficulty in designing comprehensive trade rules that can be used by the private sector is the same in trading goods or trading services, and that are either digital or non-digital. And these challenges are still actually difficult for some economies. So we look at how fostering the participation of developing economies in LDCs, and also focus on the fact that we believe Aid for Trade should focus a bit more on what I would call soft infrastructure, because in the past we have seen a lot of investment in infrastructure, hard infrastructures, and here we would like to also show the importance of soft infrastructure, so meaning regulation, capacity building, support. And it has been also mentioned by, I think, the intervention in Madagascar. So infrastructure is not sufficient. We need to build capacities to be able to use those digital infrastructure. So here we want to build the capacities of negotiators, of countries in designing trade rules that are actually enabling the population and the private sector to use those agreements and those opportunities. So thank you very much. That's all for my presentation.
Thank you very much, Pramila. And that was quite a lot to get through in all that time with very short notice. So I thank you ever so much for that. So we've had the presentations from Madagascar, from the European Union, and from the Asian Development Bank. We have about 5 minutes left before we wrap up for questions and answers. So if anybody would like to pose a question or make a comment in the chat, please do so now. We can bring it in and pick it up. While you're thinking about comments and questions, perhaps we can go back to Monsieur Raza Finsalama et voir si il peut aborder cette question que j'avais posée par rapport à la demande, comment de point de vue de quelqu'un qui travaille, qui est engagé dans le domaine dans un pays en voie de développement, envers les donateurs, comment le gouvernement peut continuer à engager dans ce domaine et mieux exprimer les besoins pour les pays donateurs. Donc, mais Monsieur Raza Finsalama, je ne sais pas si vous êtes toujours en ligne.
Oui, je sais, je suis en ligne.
Je vous en prie.
Oui, merci pour votre question. En fait, j'avais dit tout à l'heure effectivement que malheureusement la priorité du gouvernement aujourd'hui n'est pas encore totalement verdignée. Non pas qu'ils n'y pensent pas, puisque aujourd'hui, par exemple, le travail que je vous ai donné tout à l'heure, les chiffres que je vous ai donnés viennent d'une étude qui a été faite par l'Union européenne. Donc, il y a quand même des échanges avec les pays donateurs. Sauf que malheureusement, étant donné les ressources dont dispose le gouvernement, ils sont beaucoup plus focalisés sur la lutte contre la pandémie, par exemple, d'un côté, la sécheresse De l'autre côté, la semaine dernière, il y a eu un cyclone, on s'est ramassé un cyclone, donc toutes les sont beaucoup plus obligés de focaliser social, mais il n'empêche que des travaux autour des échanges avec les donateurs continuent, et notamment dans le cadre du commerce électronique, les échanges continuent, les ministres continuent à échanger avec nous sur la manière de comment capitaliser le commerce électronique pour développer le commerce local, pallier aux gros problèmes du tourisme qui a eu des gros déficits suite à la pandémie, comment utiliser le numérique pour aider les économies productives à se développer. Donc, il y a des échanges, il y a réellement des échanges, mais malheureusement, ce que je constate, et je discute avec beaucoup de nombreux ministres, ce que je constate, c'est qu'ils sont tous, en fait, malheureusement, très accaparés par les problèmes sociaux aujourd'hui, ce qui prennent un peu effectivement la manifestation de cette volonté, mais la volonté est quand même quelque part. Et je pense qu'on peut la mobiliser. Cette volonté passe aussi, je pense, par tout un ensemble de travail, de structuration, puisque au-delà des chiffres, là, heureusement, donc, il suffit qu'on a des chiffres. Au-delà des chiffres, il y a des institutions à mettre en place, et des agences, toutes les agences à renforcer pour le renforcement des secteurs. Et on n'a pas forcément les moyens aussi de mettre en place ces agences. Donc, c'est pour ça que ça prend du temps. Malheureusement, ça prend du temps. Mais je pense que la volonté est quand même quelque part et qu'on peut essayer de capitaliser sur on peut capitaliser sur la volonté de capitaliser sur le numérique est quand même existe.
Je vous remercie de votre réponse. So let me pose a question to Paz and also to Pramila. One of the points that Pramila you made in your presentation was around the growth of digital services and the role that can play for women's economic empowerment. This is something, one of the divides that was already referenced in that first section by various of the speakers. Is there something that I think as a sort of as the donor community you should be thinking of, particularly in this domain? Is it something that perhaps in terms of sort of looking at the development of e-commerce, that those digitally delivered services should be a particular focus there for thinking about gender empowerment? Is that something, Paz and Pramila, you could just pick up in a couple of words? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, thanks a lot. So there is an economic integration that will be launched on Wednesday. It looks at services, so it doesn't look at e-commerce specifically, because e-commerce activities, for example, if you trade goods, they are not digitally delivered, so it does not enter in the definition of digital services. But about the question of simply looking at the gender gap and the digital gender gap. This is not something that is now included in this report specifically because we looked at services trade, but it is an area that has been identified in some of our priorities in ADB. The digital gender gap are prevalent in Asia and the Pacific, and we have the 17% gap between women and men use of internet. So this is something we acknowledged and that we are considering also to work on. We can work on the gender issues either directly, specifically on digital connectivity, but we can also work. I think what we are currently doing is more having programs on gender and trade. We don't have a specific program on gender and trade, but we do have programs to support women in different countries, and in those programs we can think of how to integrate ICT and the use of internet in the in those programs to support women and reduce this gender gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela, and thank you for picking up on my mixture of terminology. You're absolutely right. Paz, did you want to come in and discuss this this issue of digital and digital services and women's economic empowerment? Okay, I don't think that we have her. We are pushing up against now the allotted time for today's presentation. So do please look at the comment that that Gil has just posted in the chat in response to that question. And so let me thank all of the speakers in today's workshop, starting from the top with Theo, Sylvia, Torbjorn, and oops, sorry, my mind is going blank here, and Mark, and the speakers in this session, Gil, Paz, and Pramila, for giving us such a rich set of presentations and covering such a wide range of topics in the short amount of time that we had. I don't propose to give you a detailed summary of today's discussions. There will be a summary that will be given at tomorrow's formal meeting. We will be posting all of the presentations on the event web page on the WTO website. So you'll be able to see all of that there. So in closing then, let me remind you that tomorrow's formal meeting will start tomorrow between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. And the audio recording and video recording should be up, I think, within the next day or so. We'll most likely get those presentations up faster than the audio. And lastly, let me thank you all for participating. We started off with a little over, close to 150 participants, and we closed with just over 110. So very happy with that participation today. And lastly, my thanks to the interpreters. I know you struggled with some of the connections today, so my thanks for that. And let me wish you bon appetit, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow at the CTD AveTrade formal. So thank you. With that, let me close. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Merci.